Hello everyone, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Annabelle Chaplin from the Business Review, and I will be your host. It's our pleasure to have Prism ID with us today for today's webinar, How the GUDID Was It? We're expecting the presentation to last about 50 minutes, followed by a questions and answers session. In order to ask questions, you can send them in via the questions widget, which is located at the top of your page. Just type your questions in and click submit. And we will allocate around 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session to address any questions or thoughts that you may have. We'll be collating all the questions at the end also as well, and we'll be writing written responses if we don't get round to responding to you in the live session. If you click on the survey widget, there are a few questions in there for you to answer in order to provide feedback. You can do this immediately after the webinar, and we'd really appreciate it if you do that. If you click on the green resources widget, you will find a free download. Please use the yellow help widget if you require any assistance. You can move, resize, and maximize the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. Today we have three specialist speakers, Kevin Greigel from Prism ID, Gary Sainer from ReadTech, and Neil Piper from GS1. Between them, they have over 30 years experience in life sciences arena, and their biographies are available on the registration page of the webinar. Okay, so I'm going to hand over now to Kevin.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar. This particular slide that we have up is going to give you kind of a quick snapshot of an integrated UDI solution, and it'll kind of formalize an explanation as to why we're presenting this webinar today. So in the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see Prism 360, which is our label lifecycle management software, and we consider that really a single source of truth. And what it is a platform for both the UDI label design and printing, as well as the UDI GUDID submissions. It meets all the aspects of the FDA requirements, and as you can see from the graphic, the data is stored in 360 as a shared product label, which includes additional data for both the UDI labels and the printing of that label and all UDI submissions. Gary?
Thanks, Kevin. I'll talk about the second major requirement relative to UDI, and that is reporting the device identifier in 55 other fields to the FDA. So that submission system basically has a role of collecting data, making sure that it's valid, and submitting data to the FDA Global Unique Device Identifier database, GUDID. Now, in some cases, if you have less than 100 or so products, you can elect to manually enter that in through a web interface that the FDA provides. And your PIM system then becomes relatively simple. It could be served by a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. But as you have larger product inventory, let's say over 100, you might want to start considering something that is a little bit more elegant with a database. In that case, that PIM system then builds an SPL document, which is Structured Product Labeling Document. This is a standard put forth by the Health Level 7 that the FDA has adopted. And those submissions then can be made electronically. So the company I work for here, ReadTech, as an example, we do have a database system that builds those SPL documents and submits that. And with some partnering with Prism, the data transfer can be made seamlessly between a labeling system and this submission system. So we talked about the bottom right-hand arrow going to the FDA, and that's the export, meeting the requirements for reporting that device identifier for the product to the FDA. But then there's an upper arrow there, and that would go forward as an optional export to a GS1 Global Data Synchronization Network. And Neil, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about that option.
Thank you, Gary. Hello, everyone. GS1 is one of the 3 accredited issuing agencies for product and barcode standards, which are also used within both PRISM's and Retechnology solution offerings.
Okay.
Over to you, Kevin.
Yes. So hopefully, the people that are listening to the webinar today, just give you some clarity around the various company roles that will be participating today in this submission process. So what the first item that we're going to take a look at is we're going to have a brief kind of overview, spend a few minutes on UDI. So bear with me here. So what is UDI? There are 2. The majority of you know what this is already. So you're only going to give you a brief overview. But the UDI contains 2 parts: the DI and the PI, which you'll see on a label in a few minutes. And then the global unique device identification database, captures all this information on every individual medical device product that's manufactured out there. And that database is now available to the public. And where it's available is on the NLM's Access GUDID website. Neil, could you just explain maybe a little bit about what GS1's role is within these requirements?
Certainly can. Apart from our standards use, GS1 provide annually to the FDA a list of all labelers, as the companies that register with the standards organizations for medical devices using our standards. This information then details which companies are registered with which accredited issuing agency, and we provide that information back globally back to the FDA on an annual basis.
Good. Well, thank you for that. Let's just advance to the next slide here, which, as you'll see, I'm going to have Gary talk about this, because this is dealing with all of the data attributes that the FDA has come up with. So, Gary, could you tell us a little bit more about what we're seeing on this slide?
Yeah, we won't go through each one of those attributes, but when you start collecting the data that needs to be submitted to the FDA, you soon realize, it's coming from various locations in your company, and in some cases it would include the labeling system. There's a dozen or so fields that are on the actual product label, but then there's other fields that you may not have quick access to. For example, your pre-market submission numbers, your PMAs, and any supplements might be your FDA listing number, some of your GMDN codes. So there's a number of attributes that are submitted to the FDA, 55 in total, and then the FDA receives those and derives 7 additional attributes, and a total of 62 then are stored in this database that the FDA maintains for each device that you have marketed. So the couple categories that we see in front of us are relative to the product identification of the labeler, regulatory information, package information, how you do any production control on your product, and some characteristics that are relative to your product. This is a data set that could be problematic to pull together because it has never really been needed to be assembled in one spot before. So keeping track of this, and again, you might find some data values that are inaccurate, or they may have been made obsolete. So an example of such would be a GMDN code that you had at one point in time, and that's a dynamic database. So that particular value and that code may have been made inactive and replaced by a couple more granular codes. So As you pull the data together from various locations, it could be that you'll need to make sure that they are accurate. So I'm going to move to the next slide. And Kevin, do you want to talk about some of these fields that one would find on the actual product label?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what you're looking at right now is a sample label that complies with the FDA. And, on this sample, it has a device ID, which was the DI that I talked about earlier, and the PI. And these barcodes plus 13 other bits of information is what the FDA wants to see on your labels moving forward. You can see it's very well organized. The barcode doesn't exactly have to sit in the middle, but it can sit anywhere on that label. But it does need to have those 14 items inside the label itself. So, moving on, what are the benefits to UDI? Well, as you can see, when the FDA set this up, they wanted to advance this a couple different ways. One, they wanted more accurate reporting. They wanted to reduce the medical errors that they had seen. They mainly wanted to increase patient safety, secure the distribution of this, and then make sure that this had some sort of a global recognition. But the other thing that they did is they wanted to be able to better monitor the reporting of any adverse events, so that if a product had to be recalled, the GUDID system would make that recall more efficient and thorough. So with that, as everybody knows, there's medical devices fall into three classes, 1, 2, and 3, and they're rated from the highest to the lowest risk to the patient. So, coming up, what we'll do is we'll review the timescales that are, associated with each of these classes. So now we're going to get on to the good part, the part that everybody came to listen to, and that is the survey results, which the majority of you participated in. We recently conducted this survey, and we asked professionals such as yourself within the industry about their experiences with implementing and achieving UDI compliance. So let's take a look at this first slide. And the question was, have you had to implement UDI yet? So you'll see the percentages of the respondents who implemented UDI already, and who didn't, and who were not sure if they did. So Neil and Gary, looking at these results, what are your thoughts? And is this in line with what you're seeing in the companies that you're talking to? Neil, you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure, Kevin. The audience appears roughly evenly divided. The yes answers included Class 3 implantable, life-sustaining and life-supporting labelers and any earlier UDI adopters. The no answers are expected to be Class 2 and Class 1 labelers. Hopefully this webinar should be very valuable, enabling them to plan their UDI solution for the future.
Okay.
Yeah, Kevin, my comments, I was just going to add to that, and supporting Neil's comments about the evenly divided. I think the audience that was polled probably is evenly divided, and yet there's probably a larger segment of the industry that was not polled. We do think that there's a number of Class 2 labelers and Class 1 labelers out there that have yet to implement UDI. So I think if this was across all of industry, the no value would be much higher, and then they're looking at a future implementation. Back to you, Kevin.
So, well, let's look at this then. Here we are. It's the beginning of February. And for those who have not started, which we know that is the case out there, how tough is it going to be for these individuals to meet, the the specific deadlines with 8 months to go. And before you answer, let me just advance to the next slide, which kind of gives that overview of the timescales that have been set up. So, looking at that, Gary, what about that? 8 months from now, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the industry is well aware, and although there is always a segment that is caught blindsided and not aware of the regulation and the compliance states that they need to comply to, and that's not uncommon. And as soon as they learn about it, they need to react. As to the time that it takes to actually get started, we're about 8 months out. I think it's turns out to be 170 working days. So as you count your way down toward that compliance state, Class 2 labelers should certainly make sure that their plan is well underway. Now, we have seen that the timeline to actually implement a UDI system varies quite a bit. It's based on your product portfolio size, how many assigned resources are on the project, if this includes any upgrades to your system, so you might have something already in place and you just need to enhance it, or you have to go out and purchase a brand new system. Maybe it might be a labeling system or a master data management system or some other type of supporting ERP system. Again, data availability and the quality of that data would affect your time and what GUDID submission method that you make use of. So there's a lot of factors that go into this. For some very small labelers that you might have just a handful of products, we have seen maybe 4 months operating in somewhat of a panic mode where they're able to get everything in place. And yet some large corporations have taken well over 18 months in preparation and making submissions. So the timeline varies quite a bit, Kevin.
So let's get Neil in on the conversation. Neil, what sort of comments do you have on this?
There's not a lot to add apart to Gary's comments he's made. UDI companies who are planning their journey on UDI should really start looking at creating the product codes. That's the DI element, assigning what we call GTINs to their product, determining the labeling requirements, understanding the printing and marking technologies they may be using to mark those products, determining the information that was required for the production identification. So that's the PI, the dynamic information. All of this takes considerable time and resource. So I can only just echo what Gary said. Don't delay.
So let's move on to our next question. I think we answered that sufficiently. So the question that we posed was, how have you found implementing UDI? And as you can see from this bar graph, we have results that result in how easy or difficult it's been for the respondents. It's interesting that 4% found it easy and the same percent found it extremely difficult. Gary, why don't we start off with you? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's, approaches a bell curve, but it's skewed a little bit toward difficulty. And I would have expected that with more attendees or respondents showing a more difficult rather than easy. So this is a data activity that had never been assembled before. It requires some updating standard operating procedures and collecting data to make sure things are correct. And sometimes it has influences on labeling systems. Some companies may not have had an issuing agency that was in place that is approved by the FDA, so they had to go out and do that sort of thing. So, or other companies might fall into the direct marking category and had to scramble to find some solutions there. So depending on where you fell into that spectrum, I think you're going to have a tendency toward the more difficult answer here. And I think overall, most of the respondents, it looks like 58% there, had a difficult time, although it's good to see that the 4% only reported extremely difficult, Kevin.
Okay, so, that is great to lead into the next question, which we asked, which was, how did the impact of UDI fit into your business, so that you could see that we came up with massive minimum and expected impact. And it's good to see that the majority of the respondents experienced, what they had expected in their business.
Yeah, expected. I think it was significant portion of their business revenue. So I believe, off the top of my head, the FDA estimated a few percent, let's say 3 or 4% of revenue would be targeted toward the UDI implementation. So that's a significant impact to comply with this activity. And a lot of that depends, again, on your product inventory size, what your baseline conditions are, and how far the impact of UDI went through your particular company. So yeah, in all cases, I think there's a significant effect to the planning, resources, and the overall business activity. But it looks like not too many people were surprised by the level of effort.
So with that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take a look at the next slide, which is how it's affected the various departments in those organizations. So what we asked, the question was, is areas affected by the UDI application. So as you can see, the results here are broad-reaching. All aspects, as everybody knows, of a company, included their labeling, their regulatory, quality, design, manufacturing, operations, ERP systems, distribution, whatever it is, it seems like it's touching every single aspect of the companies, and as expected, the regulatory departments in these organizations are the ones that have been the heavy contributors for this type of implementation. And what you can note is that respondents had the option to click multiple answers. Were there any departments left out of this, Gary, do you think?
Yeah, well, I was just going to add one more that we have seen. IT departments many times are included in the UDI team because of the tendency toward a technical issues and technical solution being put in place. And we've heard stories where the UDI project comes up around the table and it's quickly passed from department to department like a hot potato. No one really wants to take ownership or lead role. But for the most part, our experience matches the profile here, where ultimately it ends up on the lap of a regulatory arena. But the number of departments reflected here, I think, do verify that UDI is really a cross-functional team. So those out there that are in the regulatory department don't think that this is only going to affect you, or that it's not going to permeate throughout the whole company. There's a lot of different areas and a lot of different players that will be involved in putting a UDI solution together.
So what we wanted to do is we wanted everybody that's online to take a poll. Annabelle, would you like to introduce that, please?
Absolutely. So audience members, first poll of today's session. If you can choose the answer most relevant to yourself, please, and then we can take a look at the results and see what everyone else is thinking among the audience. And the question is, what was the most difficult part of the UDI implementation for your company? Finding making time just to do it, enhancing or implementing a new product identification standard to comply with an FDA-approved issuing agency, upgrading your labeling system and redesigning your labels, locating and submitting the data to the FDA GUDID, or other. I'll give you a few seconds to make your choice, and then we can go over and discuss the results. Okay, let's take a look at the results now and see what everybody is thinking. It's quite evenly spread out, but we've got 40.5% at upgrading your label system and redesigning your labels. Do you have any comments to make on this poll?
Well, I was going to comment. I think this, and I think we'll take a look at a similar type of question that we had asked earlier, and I believe these responded is very close to that particular profile that we had with some difficulty around updating labeling systems and redesigning labels. We know that in some cases a longer barcode produces a problem in just the real estate on the actual product label, and then followed closely after labeling, submitting data to the FDA GUDID. It looks like the 12% relative to the product identification systems is on the lower end, and then just making time to do it. So it's all kind of interesting, but 1 and 2 are probably very much in line with what we had seen earlier in some other surveys.
Neil, any thoughts?
Well, the 13% saying that looking at enhancing or implementing a new standard, it could be moving from one standard to another, I suppose, or it could be just introducing GS1 for the first time. You'll find there's lots of member organisations throughout the world that can support these companies. So I don't know the geographical breakdown of where the delegates listening to this call are from, but there is a local member organisation there to support you and provide you information on how to assign product numbers to your UDI devices, how you can start using barcodes to provide on the labels, and how you can start putting information to the GUDID as well. But it's interesting that only 14% have concerns about that.
So, it's interesting because we asked some of the same or similar questions in this survey, or poll, I should say, to the respondents in the survey. And, here are those results. And it's always good to ask the questions a second time. This was asked a little differently. This was the biggest issues that have occurred. And as you can see, compared to 39% in the poll, the online poll that we just took, 23%, felt that implementing UDI had the biggest impact on their labeling system, label design, content, followed by submitting the UDI data to the FDA GUDID system. Neil, what do you gain from all this?
Well, I've looked at the figure that stands out to me a little bit. There is the figure for 9% on direct marking on a device. Direct marking on device is probably one of the most challenging aspects of actually barcoding or labeling a product, shall we say. There's lots of different technologies you can use, whether you basically choose to use what's dot peening, impact marking, maybe laser etching. All of these technologies do require much more careful consideration than just standardly putting a label onto a product. So that's an interesting standout figure for me.
So, 15% of the respondents here, were saying that they had a big issue with the GUDID submission. And so what we're going to do, because we learned that during the survey, is we're going to have Gary take a couple minutes right now and just walk us through some of the slides that are covering the submissions.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So what we'll do is take a short break from the survey and dive a little bit deeper into the GUDID submissions and some issues surrounding that, and how you might decrease that level of pain connected to submitting data to the FDA. So on the screen there you see 5 very simple high-level steps of putting a GUDID submission in place. And as you approach submitting data to the FDA GUDID, you will soon realize that the submission process is tightly related to other aspects of the UDI. So as you perform step 1, UDI prep, it's best to ensure that GUDID submission tasks are in the plan and not an afterthought. Now, there's various data submission solutions, either manual keyboard entry using the FDA GUDID web interface, or you can make electronic submissions using SPL files that we had alluded to earlier. But in either case, select the best method for your particular scenario, and then you want to install supporting systems and create necessary FDA accounts. So there's FDA GUDID accounts that all labelers need to create, and in some cases a ESG, Electronic Submission Gateway account, would need to be created. In step 3, preparing the GUDID data, this can be a challenge, as we talked about earlier. Data scattered about your company location, and it's not always correct, or it might be outdated. Then as you move to step 4, the actual submission of the data to the FDA, you'll need to put some close controls in place. So if you are making use of the manual keyboard entry, typically that is followed up by a quality check. And if you're using the SPL automatic or electronic file submission, then you'll need to have a 21 Part 11 compliance system for that particular environment, and make sure that you verify the FDA acknowledgement messages. So once you finally make all these submissions, time to take a break, celebrate, but don't close down the submission process. There's still maintenance activities that need to be in place. Any records that have been submitted need to be held or kept current, so you may have to submit updated records. If you have a version change or a model change for that product, a new record would need to be submitted, or if you release a new product. And if that isn't enough, then keep an eye on the international scene. Various regional agencies, EU, Canada, Australia, Japan, China, Brazil, and it goes around the world, are looking at UDI. There's activities in many of these locations. So I'm going to move to the next slide. That gives you an overall high-level view of some of the steps to get a GUDID submission in place. And we have submitted, we've helped clients submit over 120,000 device records, and we have seen some mistakes. So again, to try to ease your pain going forward, there's 2 slides that we'll talk about here, and then we'll go back to the survey. But this first slide has to do with data mistakes, and the next slide has to do with submission mistakes. So this is a list that we've compiled. It's some of the more frequent errors that were found. There's actually a couple in here from the FDA that they ask you to keep in mind when you're submitting data. The 3 that we identified, we don't have time to go through all of these, but the 3 with the arrows on the left-hand side there have to do with device identifiers. And Neil, I'm going to ask you just to join in here for a second, where these that have to do with device identifiers, maybe you'd like to comment on those.
Yeah, sure. Starting from the top, the top arrow, it says include 0, 1, or plus in the device identifier. When submitting a device identifier, the value must not include what we call in GS1 standards well the GS1 application identifier. So that's, in this instance, it's the bracketed 0, 1. The FDA will refer to that application identifier as a data delimiter. So for GS1, it's the 01. For the HIBIC standards, it's the plus sign. Okay, so those are a couple of common mistakes that people do by putting that into the GUDID. The second one down, so that's the invalid check digit, is when submitting your device identifier, people are sometimes getting what's called the check digit wrong. Okay, they're putting a number in at the end of their data structure that is actually incorrect. Okay, and check digits are quite common within data standards. If they're invalid, the data is incorrect. Okay, so GS1, GS1 UK and GS1 MOs, we offer online check digit calculators, and there's spreadsheets out there that do that, and also barcode labeling software like Prisms does that as an online check, as an automatic check as well when you create the GTIN or the number and put it into a barcode. Moving down to the third one, the invalid packaging configuration count, etc. There's considerable confusion, numerous questions and errors regarding the UDI assignment and reporting of the UDI on packaging levels. So as an example is determining the base product, applying the unit of dose, device identifier, not reporting the 1 item in, 1 package level, the shipping containers, etc. So as and when you have questions, feel free to contact the presenters for help on this, because it does confuse a lot of people. As stated, it is one of the most common mistakes for submission.
Well, thank you, Neil. I'm going to move to the next slide, and in the sake of time, we'll just talk about one item on here, the missing hung submissions where there's not an acknowledgement returned back from the FDA. So one would think this is a pretty well defined process, and for the most part it is. We've seen a small percentage, roughly 3% of records that are submitted to the FDA, and for whatever reason there's a restart or a queue gets reset, or there's some kind of a system glitch, who knows. But in any case, there's not 3 acknowledgments that would come back. In some cases you'd only get 2, and the third one might be missing, whatever. So it's important to keep in mind, if you are submitting records by way of the SPL file format method, that you'll need to do a one-to-one check to make sure that all submitted records have the acknowledgement back from the FDA. In some cases, a help desk ticket would help clarify that issue. But that kind of concludes our little dive into some of the mistakes. Hopefully those are good for you to look at, and as you have time, you might want to go back and check some others out. And I think what we'll do now is go back to the survey questions. Kevin?
Yeah, so this is a great question, especially in the order that it's falling right now, and that is, are you ready for an FDA inspection? And as you can see, it appears that probably about 60% of the survey respondents said they needed additional time and help in preparing for for an FDA inspection. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I mean, UDI implementation causes changing to a lot of labelling processes, and these reach further into the standard operating procedures for a lot of businesses and their reported practices as well.
Gary, what's your thought?
Well, I was going to add a little bit about the reporting. Many times that is kind of an afterthought when you read through the final rule. It's one of the final sections. But UDI does pop up on your periodic reports, certainly in your quality system, some of your production tracking reports, certainly your MDR for adverse events. When you report an event and a UDI is available, you need to submit that. So, and reporting for the compliance to the FDA is in that category as well. So keep in mind that there's surrounding compliance requirements for each of these reporting aspects, and all subject to the FDA inspection. Kevin?
Yeah, so kind of a great segue into the next area. So we thought we'd offer some thoughts on that. When you're complying with this FDA requirement here, and if you're not ready for the UDI, what are some of the things that you should consider? So, ask yourself any of these 5 questions. I'll run through them fairly quickly. How is your data stored, and is it consistent and stored in a single system? Another question that you could ask yourself and your team would be, can your technology platform adapt to these new processes? And then how does the UDI impact other areas and parts of your supply chain? It's not just a label change, as we've indicated and gone through here. What's the global impact, and do you have a clear kind of plan of action? So if we go on to the next one, which is for an inspection, and can you provide? So Gary, you can take a look at these results here. The question was, can you provide, and given the following identifiers under each one of the bar graphs, what do you see in these results? I know you've had a chance to study them and look at them.
Yeah, I think the yes, it shows good preparation for an inspection. Some of the font's a little small there, but as you progress from left to right, producing evidence for device attributes, and then device issuing agency, and the third one there has to do with MDRs, and the fourth one has to do with recalls and so on. I think the yeses are strong, and yet they're not, 100%. So there's a little bit of room for growth here, and a little bit of further understanding. I suspect this might be because it's relatively new product and issue and a new domain of data. So there's a little bit of a learning curve, but I'm encouraged to see the yeses, and hopefully a year from now they would be a lot higher. Kevin, did you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so, one of the things that we did is we brought up to the professionals that were taking the survey, the quality systems. And so we asked them, can you ensure that your quality system includes the processes and systems used to maintain the data attributes submitted to the FDA GUDID in compliance with 21 CFR Part 820 and Part 11? So as you can see, the results in this one show that 57% of the respondents are not certain that their quality system meets FDA compliance standards.
Yeah, and
Gary,
I think that,
your experience.
well, Kevin, I was just going to quick comment that this kind of picks up on the previous slide where there's room for growth here. And I think there has to be some education on requirements. Certainly some SOP updates need to be put in place and approved. Some software tool perhaps, and maybe some enhancements or replacement, and some user training. But there's definitely room for growth here on the quality system. We want to go to the next question then?
Yeah, we do. It's regarding labeling software solutions, which I'm very familiar with. And you can see in this slide here that 29% of the respondents, don't have a labeling software solution. Neil, what are your thoughts on that answer there, or the way that they framed it up?
Yeah, it seems to show that a numerous amount of small and mid-sized companies tend to avoid some sort of out-of-the-box labeling solution, and appear to be spending a lot of their resources linking the low-cost tools together to generate the labels. But they may find that this is a fragmented solution, doesn't deliver accurate, consistent results, and it doesn't even meet the FDA compliance standards, which also includes the validation.
I'm glad that you brought up, that part on validation. Within any organization, what we find is that the process you need to be able to prove that a transaction or an action has happened, and its outcome from that. So what we've seen is that as far as the FDA is concerned, that if you cannot prove it, then it didn't happen. And on that basis, having a system that is completely validated will close any of the gaps and reduce any of those particular errors. So let's then move on to the conclusion of the survey, and to answer that initial question that we posed in the webinar title, have the benefits of UDI outweighed the pain? And I talked to a number of people and our staff at our company, and we don't believe that the medical device manufacturers or the downstream users, really realized any significant benefits from it yet. Although we did not elaborate on the actual UDI benefits, there seems to be some considerable pain in implementing UDI. So, our recommendation is be prepared, and if you can, if you're just starting out on that UDI journey, hopefully we can report, these growing benefits a year from now. And, there are some isolated reports on improving, the internal and the external distribution efficiencies, and that's due to better product identification. But also there is a growing UDI interest expressed by hospitals and as well as healthcare providers. So stay tuned. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite Gary to talk about the upcoming challenges of meeting the GUDID submission deadline of this coming September. Gary, you want to take it away there?
Sure. I'm going to advance a slide and just talk very quickly in consideration of the time of the webinar and allowing some Q&A time here at the end. But on this slide, you see the high volume of expected Class 2 submissions for September of this year, and it literally doubles or roughly doubles what was submitted last year. And looking at the performance of last year, there was considerable overload at the FDA as far as being able to accept data. There were some system downtimes and processing delays. We noticed that during the final crunch days last year, that an acknowledgement message, which normally took about 12 minutes to come back, was delayed for 3 days. So there was definitely some activity at the FDA to try to accommodate that, but we'll see if there's any delays. I would not count on an extension for September, so keep in mind the September 24th timeline, and realizing that in this particular wave this fall, that many labelers are small, they have limited regulatory staff, so there'll be probably more questions. So getting answers back from the FDA help desk may take a little bit longer than normal. And I think the bottom line here is, as we conclude this discussion, is that those Class 2 manufacturers that are facing the September deadline, you really ought to be looking at starting your process now if you haven't already done so, and make every effort to submit early. And with that, Kevin, I think I'm going to progress this and have us take a look at some of the questions that have come in while we've been going over some of the material. Sure.
Annabelle, do you want to have us lead us in that?
Absolutely. So audience members, it's now time for the Q&A. Got a really great response on the questions now, but if you do have any questions or comments for any of the presenters, please do just send them in. If we don't get to address your question, I'm sure the presenters will be more than happy to give you a detailed response via email. Okay, so I'm going to go in at the first question now. And the first question is, when will the FDA include inspection of UDI compliance during their routine inspections? Any thoughts?
I've heard a couple instances where the FDA has already looked for UDI during their inspections and wanted to see documentation surrounding UDI. And I think it'll be an evolving timeline, so it won't be on and off sort of thing. It could be over a transition time, and it could include anywhere from the evidence for submissions. There's some requirements in the rule about having a record of the device identifier and the products that you have in production, and all the way through. They could ask some questions about 21 Part 11 compliance of submitted SPL documents. So we don't see it yet. I have not heard a firm deadline of checking for UDI on UDI inspections, and yet on the other hand, there has been a couple of reports where a company came up short on some UDI documentation. Others?
I'm good. I don't have anything.
Okay. Next question.
Okay. The next question that we've had in is it necessary to install a vision type inspection system on our printers to meet the UDI compliance requirements?
So I'll take that one. The answer is no. It's not a requirement. However, I would recommend that if you're working towards achieving a zero defect labeling for your organization, then automating your label inspection process is the way to go. By basically eliminating that weakest link in your system, which the majority of people, they all started that way, is using the human eye. You need to strongly consider moving in the direction which we're seeing the majority of organizations go. I mean, if you think about it this way, you've spent a lot of time, money, to get your UDI labels approved. I would ask, basically, why risk, a potential FDA recall or a warning letter, because it all related to basically the blink of an eye. Gary?
Let me add just one other thought. I was just going to add something, Kevin, to that, where we have heard of a slightly different implementation for barcode verification. Now, I realize that's not a 100% vision system, but keep that in mind also, that there is some requirements by various standards to have a certain grade of barcode. So a labeler needs to make a decision. Is that a one-time startup verification, or is that a periodic sampling, or is it 100%? I've heard the sampling is actually most common, but that's another aspect of putting something in line to verify your barcodes.
Okay.
It's Neil here. I completely agree with that.
Great. Well, I think that's it on that particular question. Any other ones, Annabelle?
Oh, yeah, we've got lots to get through here. How likely is a smooth synchronization of the GUDID and subsequent regulatory spaces UDI bases?
I think the question was, would one expect any synchronization between the regional databases? As an example, FDA sharing data with Health Canada or the EU or something like that. And hopefully that was the question. We have not heard any plans to share data. So as you make an evaluation and decide to submit data to the FDA, the method that you select, if you do manual entry, for example, into that one solution at the FDA, and you mimic that in other places, then you'll be re-entering that data multiple times, all manual entry with labor and some quality checks. So that would tend to have one consider, is it reasonable to use a system that's more database related and allows the reuse of number of fields? So a rough estimate is about 80% of the fields would be reused across agencies. So looking at the FDA to Health Canada, EU to Australia and so on. If you had a system that was able to reuse the content, then it would simply be a matter of adding the dedicated information, the exclusive information for EU, for example, and then building a record and sending that off. So as of yet, we've heard no mention of the agency sharing the data. Any other comments or next question?
Okay, I'll take it into the next question. And it is, when will Class 2 device manufacturers be able to open a GUDID account and submit data?
Oh, actually, I had just received an update on that. It was expected to be January 1 of this year, but the FDA has delayed that to February 1. So there's actually an FDA webinar today that is being presented, and I expect that question to come up there and probably reinforced. But it's our understanding that February 1 is the date in which Class 2 manufacturers are able to get a FDA GUDID account.
Okay, great. I'll move us into the next question. And this is a comment. My understanding is that GUDID does not apply to single-use disposable devices. Is that correct?
Well, I can jump in on that one. That's not correct. Single-use devices would be considered a medical device, and the UDI rule applies to all medical devices. Now, there are some exceptions. There's exceptions for investigative devices. There's exceptions for a national stockpile, for veterinary devices. But as you go down through the list, and there's some provisions for Class 1 devices, but all devices actually need to submit a record to the FDA that I'm aware of, it, unless it's explicitly mentioned as an exception in the UDI rule.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for one more question now. We might be able to squeeze in another. The question is, one issue our team is struggling with at this point is being sure which information is mandatory on a device label and which information is not. Can you help or clarify things?
Gary, do you want to take that?
Oh, I was thinking that you were going to jump in on the labeling question. Do you want to take a first cut at it, or I'm sorry.
Do you want me to repeat it for you?
Yeah, please go ahead.
It says, one issue our team is struggling with at this point is being sure which information is mandatory on a device label and which information is not. Could you clarify or help, please?
Well, one of the things we did is we had the slide up on the screen, which gave the specific 14 fields that are necessary to be on that particular label, and that came basically from those data attributes that the people would start compiling. And then what the FDA did is move those specific items into the label, which is what's required. So, you know, what we can do is we don't have enough time to go through all that right now, but if you were to drop us a line at the end, we'd be more than happy to share some information with you. You'll see our email address will be posted at the end.
Yeah, can I jump in and compliment what you had mentioned there, Kevin? The label that we looked at, the FDA had put together and identified some of those fields. But there are some subtleties in the UDI rule. It doesn't require any new fields to be on the label except for the UDI itself and in human readable form, and also in an AIDC form, so an automatic data collection form. So most people use a barcode. So putting a barcode and the UDI in human readable form are required to be in place by the UDI final rule. The UDI final rule does not go over that or discuss any additional fields. So any of the previous predicate rules that identified contents on a label are still in place and they're in force. So meeting those still have to be in place. So UDI just talks about that UDI. And the other thing to keep in mind is if the label currently has some of these production identifiers, such as a lot number, serial number, manufacturing expiration date, and so on, if it has those on the label, then they need to be included in the UDI production identifier section. But the UDI does not require you to add them. So if you don't use those for production control and they're not on the label, the rule does not require that you add them. So, you know, just read the UDI closely to include or not include items that you might have already on your label, and realize that, you know, there's not requirements to add something that you didn't already have, except for the UDI itself. Hopefully that helps, you know, close that comment. And then maybe, unless you had further comments, Neil or Kevin?
Yes, Neil, I was just looking at one of the other questions there was on you're talking about labeling and the date format, and one of the questions was, is there an agreed date format? I can't see the question now. I'm skimming through all the the 71 questions we have in the inbox. But there was a standardised format for the date. So to answer that question, it's year dash month dash day. So that's the date the UDI, the FDA required. Okay.
Right. Well, and I think that's a real good point. Some companies already had date on their label, and now they would have to change the format. And we have seen that many companies did not make use of the day before, and they just put a year, a month sort of thing, where now coming up with a date. And the FDA recommendation is to use, the last day of the month if you don't have any other default. But, yeah, that's a good point to make sure your date format is in place.
Okay, if I can just jump in. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Very active hour that was. Lots and lots of questions. I do apologise if we didn't get to answer your question, and I'm sure the presenters are going to be very busy at responding to each of you there. But before I just wrap up, presenters, is there anything that you'd like to say to the audience members today?
Well, I just want to give a quick thank you to PRISM for hosting, and Neil over at GS1 to join us. Thank you very much for joining us, and if there's further questions, feel free to connect by email, and we'd be glad to help.
Ditto that from Kevin at PRISM. We'd be more than happy to get back to you on all your questions. May take a couple of days, but we will get back to you on those. And we do appreciate your attendance, and sorry for going over here.
And ditto from Neil. If people are looking at joining GS1 or are members of GS1 and have questions, our email address is there. We can certainly answer those via email. It's a dedicated email address for those questions.
Thank you very much, presenters. And again, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Kevin, Gary, and Neil for participating today. We hope you've enjoyed the presentation and found it informative. To the attendees, and there's a lot of you been asking, you'll receive an email shortly telling you how you can access the on-demand version of this webinar. And you can access this for a year and watch it as many times as you'd like to. And this is at our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. Once this webinar ends, today's survey will appear in its place, and we would appreciate it if you answer the questions in there. We look forward to sharing further webinars with you, so please do keep an eye out on the website just mentioned, and follow us on Twitter at BRWebinars for daily updates, and join our LinkedIn group, Business Review Webinars. Thanks once again, and I hope you all have a great day.